Right in the middle of her granddaughter's wedding, she collapsed, bleeding, silent, and carrying a secret she'd buried for over 30 years. Why did Margaret Dawson suffer in silence for decades? Why did no doctor ever listen? And what happened when the truth finally came out? If you believe some stories deserve to be heard, subscribe now and stay with us to uncover a journey of pain, silence, and ultimate strength. It was the kind of morning that smelled faintly of cinnamon and cold earth. The air in Lancaster, Pennsylvania had a softness to it, filtered through the amber hue of late October leaves. Margaret Dawson stood on the wooden porch of her home, the same two-story cottage she had lived in for nearly 4 decades. She wore her usual gray sweater, thick wool skirt, and that old felt hat with the feather tucked into the band. A basket dangled from her arm, empty now, but soon to be filled with apples and eggs from the farmer's market down on Maple Street. She moved slowly, not because of age, though 67 years rested gently on her bones, but because every step down that porch staircase felt like walking through water laced with shards of glass. Pain was no longer something she noticed. It was simply part of the scenery. No one ever asked her why she winced slightly before stepping off the last stair. No one questioned why she always sat during church services, or why she never danced at weddings, not even at her own children's receptions. People just assumed she was tired, or perhaps fragile in the way older women sometimes are. But the truth had never been about fragility. For 30 years, Margaret had lived with a pain she never named, not even to herself. She had learned to tuck it away, like old linens kept in cedar chests, used only in memory. Her body was a quiet battlefield, one she crossed each morning without fanfare, without audience. She had children who called now and then, grandchildren who brought school photos in frames, neighbors who waved. And yet, she had never told a soul. Margaret reached the end of the porch, steadying herself with the carved banister Thomas had built so many years ago, back when he still came home by 6 and brought tulips in spring. She touched the wood gently, fingers running over the smoothness worn by time and weather. Then she descended the last step, slow, calculated. She bit the inside of her cheek, a tiny habit that kept the pain from showing on her face. The street was quiet. A few leaves skittered along the pavement, chased by the wind. In the distance, church bells began to ring, and Margaret, with a straightened back and a woven basket on her arm, began to walk toward town, each step echoing a silence no one had dared to question. Margaret passed the row of sycamore trees lining the sidewalk, each leaf trembling in the morning wind like quiet applause. The town had changed, of course. The old hardware store was now a small cafe that served oat milk and scones. The corner post office had become a boutique selling candles with names like Rain on Birch and September in Paris. But the faces, many of them still the same, familiar nods, soft smiles, people who knew her as the woman who baked pies for every church potluck and never missed a Sunday service. She greeted them with polite warmth, a nod here, a wave there. No one noticed how her right hand trembled just slightly when it left the warmth of her pocket. No one saw her pause before each curb, checking her footing not with fear, but with calculation. She had memorized every bump in the sidewalk over the years, each crack like a secret known only to her and time. There had been moments, of course, when she almost said something. A doctor's visit for high blood pressure, a fall in the kitchen that left her with bruised ribs and a limp for a month. But every time she opened her mouth, the words stopped halfway up her throat, like something stuck not in her body, but in her spirit. Shame was a heavy language, and Margaret had become fluent. Back in the early days, after Thomas left, after the pain had started to grow from discomfort into daily agony, she had considered writing it down. Maybe just a few sentences, something private. But the pen felt like a betrayal. Putting it into words would make it real. Naming it would mean acknowledging not only the pain, but also the choices she made to live with it in silence. So instead, she cooked, she cleaned, she raised her children with hands that ached. She lifted laundry baskets while holding her breath. She avoided mirrors. She skipped doctor's appointments. She adjusted, like women of her generation had been taught to do. Margaret arrived at the market just as the sun broke fully through the clouds, casting golden light across the brick pavement. She walked past rows of apples, their scent sharp and sweet. The baker's wife waved. Margaret smiled, bought a dozen eggs, a loaf of rye bread, and a small jar of orange marmalade. Her basket heavier now, she turned toward home. And as she walked back, pain nested quietly in her belly, just as it had every day for 30 years, present, persistent, and unseen. The winter of 1988 came early that year, blanketing the hills outside Lancaster in a hush of snow before Thanksgiving. Margaret had just given birth to her fourth child, a quiet little girl named Laura, who weighed barely 6 pounds and slept with her fists curled tightly against her chest. The delivery had been long, 18 hours, with complications. She had torn badly, and the doctor, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and a silver stethoscope that clinked against his chest, offered only a brief glance between stitches. "You'll be sore for a while," he said, not unkindly, but without much thought. "4 babies will do that to you." Margaret smiled thinly and nodded. She didn't ask questions. She never had. Thomas had stood near the window the whole time, arms folded, staring out into the parking lot. He'd come to the hospital late, missed most of the labor. When he did speak, it was about the furnace back home acting up again, or how he hated driving in icy weather. He didn't hold the baby until a nurse placed her directly into his arms. Margaret watched him from the hospital bed, her body broken open but her heart strangely still. She knew things had shifted, not just inside her marriage, but inside her own skin. Weeks passed. The soreness didn't fade, it deepened, a dragging weight in her pelvis, a dull ache when she stood too long. At first, she assumed it was part of healing. But then the pressure became something else, something heavier, something wrong. She told herself it was normal. She had 4 children now, after all. What did she expect? Still, the pain persisted. It grew more noticeable during chores, when she lifted the laundry basket, when she bent to retrieve toys, when she stood at the kitchen sink peeling carrots. There was a tugging feeling, a downward pull that made her clench her jaw to hide a wince. But she said nothing, not to Thomas, who had grown more distant since Laura's birth. Longer hours at work, shorter temper, and the faintest scent of perfume Margaret didn't wear clinging to his shirt some nights. Not to her mother, who had raised 5 children herself and once said, "Pain is just proof you're still alive." Not to the doctor, whom she saw only once after the delivery, during a rushed 6-minute checkup that ended with a pat on the arm and no further questions. So Margaret kept quiet, and each time she felt her body straining, weakening, folding in ways it never had before, she simply pulled her cardigan tighter around her frame and kept moving forward. By the time spring arrived, Margaret had developed a quiet choreography of pain. She timed her steps carefully, avoided crouching if she could help it, and learned to brace her hands against counters or chairs before rising. The discomfort in her lower body had grown sharper, a pulling sensation that now came with a foreign heaviness. At night, after the children were asleep, she would lie flat on the floor, arms spread like wings, waiting for the pressure to ease. But no one saw this version of her. In front of the children, she moved like any other mother, steady, practical, always present. She folded clothes, packed lunches, tied shoelaces, and kissed bruised foreheads. She baked birthday cakes and patched knees in jeans. Her voice never cracked, her smile never trembled. That, she thought, was what strength looked like. Quiet. Inconvenient. Unseen. Thomas noticed nothing, or chose not to. He was home less often now. First it was late meetings. Then it was overnight shifts. Then there were weekends when he claimed he had work out of town, even when Margaret saw the familiar Ford still parked near the edge of town at odd hours. She never followed, never asked. What would be the point? She found a long, pale hair on his wool coat once. Not her color, not hers. It clung to the collar like a whisper. She brushed it off and didn't speak of it. That night, when he came home, she placed his dinner on the table as usual. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes. He grunted something that might have been thanks and ate with his head down. The silence between them had become its own language. But what Margaret did notice, far more than any affair, was that she had started avoiding mirrors. When she undressed, she did it quickly, in the dark and with averted eyes. Her body no longer felt like hers. There were days she stood in the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink, as the floor seemed to tilt beneath her. She never cried, though sometimes she whispered apologies to no one in particular. It wasn't until one night, when she leaned too far while lifting her youngest from the bathtub, that she felt something shift inside her, a sensation like slipping, like falling from within. She gasped, stumbled, and gripped the towel rack so tightly it cracked loose from the wall. That was the moment Margaret knew. This wasn't just childbirth aftershock. It was something else, something worse. But even then, she told no one. The letter was not long, a few lines scribbled in Thomas's uneven handwriting, left on the kitchen counter beside a half-empty coffee mug and his wedding band. Margaret read it twice, then folded it neatly and slipped it into the back of the drawer where she kept old bills and warranty cards. He had gone. No explanations beyond what was obvious. Another woman, another town, another life he had chosen without her. She did not call him. She did not cry. There were 4 children asleep upstairs and a sink full of dishes to finish. Grief could wait. Survival could not. That night she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her palm gently against the bulge low in her abdomen. The pressure had worsened in recent weeks. Something was descending, pulling downward like a weight on a fraying rope. She could feel it now, even when she lay flat. A presence. Foreign. Wrong. She thought of returning to the doctor, of describing what she felt, how sometimes she struggled to hold her urine, how certain movements made her feel like something inside was slipping out. But then she remembered the last visit, the distracted eyes, the wave of the hand. Part of aging, he had said. These things happen after childbirth. And so she closed the door on that possibility. Instead, Margaret adjusted her life around the pain. She lifted groceries differently. She walked slower. She stopped attending gatherings that required long hours of standing. She began lining her undergarments with absorbent cloth, hand-cut and folded, so no one would see what she would never speak. The children never asked why she winced when lifting them. They never noticed how she leaned against walls in the kitchen when she cooked. To them, she was just mom, steady, quiet, always there. In her mind, the logic was simple. This was the price of motherhood, of womanhood. Pain was currency, silence was virtue. And if she bore it well, maybe her daughters would grow strong. Her sons respectful. In the months that followed, Margaret no longer thought of herself as a woman with a body. She became function, motion, a pair of hands that sewed, fed, cleaned, and corrected homework. There was no time for mirrors, for softness, for tending to herself. She was mother. She was the roof and the walls. And slowly, without any ceremony or notice, she disappeared from her own story, leaving only the shell of a woman who once, long ago, thought she'd be seen. There was no room for collapse. After Thomas left, life reorganized itself not around loss, but necessity. Mornings began earlier, before sunrise, before noise, so she could hang clothes out to dry and prepare oatmeal for 4 hungry mouths. Lunches packed, socks matched, teeth brushed. A routine made not out of ease but obligation. The house stayed warm because she learned to tend the furnace. The bills got paid because she took in mending from neighbors, altered sleeves and hems with a precision born of need. Her fingers grew calloused, her knuckles stiff, but she never complained. The ache in her hips and belly became another familiar sensation, like the cold of the porch in February, or the dampness that crept in under the window when it rained, unpleasant but expected. And the pain, what lived deep inside her, was now part of her name. Sometimes it worsened without warning, a sharp stab while she reached for the top shelf, a feeling of something slipping downward when she knelt too quickly. She began wearing 2 layers of underwear, reinforced with folded cloth she rinsed by hand in the laundry room sink. Not out of shame, out of control. She became adept at hiding, from her children, from friends, from her reflection. She no longer went to church potlucks. She declined invitations to weddings, citing fatigue. She avoided sitting on soft chairs that made standing again a battle of dignity. And always, she smiled. Always, she spoke softly. The world did not need to know what her body screamed in silence. Each night, after the children were asleep, Margaret would sit by the kitchen window, looking out at the empty yard. Sometimes she'd wrap her arms around herself and sway gently, a motion that seemed to soothe the unseen. She began talking to herself, not in madness but in memory. She remembered being 17, standing barefoot on the summer grass, while Thomas had kissed her hand and called her wild and golden. She remembered her wedding dress, which her mother had sewn by hand. She remembered the soft lilt of lullabies she used to hum without pain, back when rocking a baby didn't make her wince. None of that version of her remained. Now, she moved as if carrying something fragile between her legs, careful with each motion. She had long since stopped wondering if it was normal. She had accepted it, like rain in April or taxes in April. Inevitable, unavoidable. What mattered was that the children never knew What mattered was that breakfast was on the table and homework was checked, and no one ever saw her limp when she thought they weren't looking. That was her offering, her way of loving, quiet, invisible, complete. The older Margaret became, the smaller her world grew. What had once been a life filled with social calendars, church functions, and community dinners had gradually narrowed into a corridor of silence bordered by duty and endurance. She told herself it was by choice, that she'd grown more private with age, but deep down she knew the truth. It wasn't privacy she was choosing, it was concealment. She no longer accepted visitors unless she had time to prepare, time to clean the bathroom meticulously, to make sure no signs of her makeshift hygiene system were visible. She learned to tuck cloth pads into tightly sealed bags before disposing of them. She bought pain relievers discreetly, at odd hours, from pharmacies where she wasn't recognized. Margaret was an expert in the rituals of hiding. Even her wardrobe had changed. She only wore skirts with extra length and volume, nothing tight, nothing that might show a shift in her posture or the careful way she now sat and rose. She had developed an instinctual awareness of space and motion. Every action was edited, every movement rehearsed. Neighbors occasionally asked questions, gentle and well-meaning. "Not feeling up to the Christmas gathering this year, Margaret? You didn't bring your famous cranberry pie to the bake sale. You all right, hun? Or you seem thinner these days." She smiled, always smiled, said she was just tired, said she'd been reading more, staying home, enjoying the peace. No one pressed. She was Margaret Dawson, steady, kind, a widow who had done her best. Who would question her? Until one Tuesday morning something slipped. She was bringing laundry up from the basement, arms full of towels, one hand gripping the wooden rail. Her footing missed by just half an inch, and she stumbled. Not a full fall, but a hard twist that threw her weight sideways. The towels flew, and she landed awkwardly, her elbow knocking against the wall, her hip striking the third stair. The pain that followed wasn't the pain of bruises or scrapes. It was deeper, heavier, a shift inside that she felt even through the layers of fabric and painkillers. She sat there for a long time, not crying, not calling for help, just breathing, listening to the washing machine hum below and the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. Later, when Alice from next door came by with a casserole and rang the doorbell, Margaret didn't answer. She lay upstairs, motionless on the bed, her body aching in ways she could no longer ignore, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The doorbell rang again, then silence. Margaret closed her eyes and made herself small. No one could know. Not yet, not ever. Time had a way of dissolving years into patterns. Mornings of oatmeal and folded napkins, evenings of slow footsteps and lukewarm tea. As the seasons cycled, so did Margaret's world, each turn quieter than the last. Her children had grown, as children do. 2 had moved across the state, another to the city, one still nearby but busy, always busy. They called. They visited on holidays. They brought store-bought pies and new shoes for her birthday. They hugged her gently, never noticing the tight way she held her hips, the faint wince behind each smile. Occasionally they expressed concern. "You're losing weight, Mom. You're walking slower than usual. Why don't you come live with us? You don't need to do everything alone." But Margaret had her replies polished and ready. Soft words, measured tone, eyes kind but firm. "I like the quiet. My bones are just older now. This house is full of memories. It keeps me company." And because she had never been the type to ask for anything, her children believed her. Still, the loneliness pressed inward like fog. It was not a loud thing, but it settled deep in her ribs and wrapped around her spine. Not sadness, she would not dignify it with such poetry. No, it was practicality, the simple arithmetic of silence plus pain plus time. But in that thick silence there was one light, Emily. Her first grandchild, now a young woman with sharp wit and a softness around the eyes that reminded Margaret of her own mother. Emily still came every other week, always bringing flowers from the farmer's market or a book or fresh peaches wrapped in paper towels. They would sit in the kitchen and talk about nothing, about the weather, about how overpriced college was, about Emily's dream wedding dress, which would be ivory, not white, because, as she said with a wink, white is for lies and illusions and I want truth. Margaret laughed at that, the rare kind of laugh that tugged at the edges of a soul. But she never told Emily the truth about her own body. Never hinted, never allowed the girl to see beyond the curated stillness. There were moments, flickers, when she wanted to reach across the table and say, "I need help," to admit that she no longer slept through the night, that some mornings she bled without reason, that walking to the mailbox had become a journey of fire and grit. But the words would not come. They would collect behind her teeth and die there. Instead, she memorized the sound of Emily's laugh. She watched the girl's hands, so young and unscarred, flutter over a teacup. She said little. She smiled a lot, and she poured all the tenderness she had left into those visits, storing them like sunlight in a jar. Because something told her the jar would be needed soon. Emily had been born on a stormy night in mid-June, under a sky that pulsed with distant thunder and violet lightning. Margaret remembered the call, her daughter out of breath, her voice shaky but strong. She had rushed to the hospital, gripping the steering wheel with fingers gone white, her lower back aching from another sleepless night. When she first saw Emily, tiny and red-faced in a wool blanket, something in her chest loosened. The world, which had felt heavy and tight for years, suddenly cracked open. She was the first to hold her, even before the nurses brought the newborn to her parents. That night, Margaret sang the same lullaby her own mother had once whispered in broken French, her voice raspy from tears she hadn't known were there. The baby had blinked slowly, as if recognizing something ancient in her face. From the beginning, there was something sacred in the bond between them. Emily was the only child who reached for Margaret first when she entered a room. As a toddler, she would crawl onto Margaret's lap and trace the wrinkles on her hands like they were maps. She never asked what they meant, only followed the lines with soft fingers saying, "These are your tree lines, right, Grandma? They help you grow." Margaret never corrected her. In those early years, when Emily still wore pigtails and mismatched socks, she became Margaret's shadow. They baked cookies in silence, planted tulip bulbs in spring, and painted birdhouses in 100 imperfect colors. Emily once insisted on building a fort beneath the kitchen table and made Margaret crawl in with her. It had taken effort. Margaret's hips protested, her back screamed, but she had gone, laughing through clenched teeth. Inside the tiny fort, lit by a single flashlight and lined with throw pillows, Emily had asked, "What does being old feel like?" Margaret had paused, then answered, "It feels like remembering everything at once." Emily had nodded, satisfied with the answer, and handed Margaret a graham cracker. Those moments, quiet, unremarkable to others, became Margaret's sanctuary. In a life that had narrowed into chores and caution, Emily was the wide-open window. She reminded Margaret that joy didn't need permission, that even a woman stitched together with silence could still be loved, fully and without question. Margaret never told her about the condition, not even when Emily started school, or when she turned 10 and began noticing things, why Grandma always sat instead of standing, why she sometimes disappeared into the bathroom for longer than necessary. Emily never asked. And Margaret, for as much as she wanted to explain, feared the undoing of that gentle trust, so she stayed quiet and hoped that love could outrun the truth. By the time Emily turned 15, she had outgrown pigtails and forts under kitchen tables. She wore flannel shirts, borrowed from thrift stores, and kept a dog-eared notebook filled with half-finished poems and pressed flowers. Her laughter was still frequent, still unguarded, but there was a new sharpness behind her eyes, a readiness to question, to notice what others missed. Margaret saw it coming. Girls like Emily didn't stay soft forever. They grew edges, learned patterns, began to read between silences. Still, Emily visited regularly. She biked over after school, let herself in with the spare key beneath the porch planter, and made tea before Margaret could even ask. They would sit in the kitchen as they always had, the same blue curtains swaying, the same chipped saucers holding shortbread cookies. The world outside moved forward, politics, wars, scandals, but in that kitchen, time seemed to hum at its own gentle rhythm. And yet, Emily was beginning to see. She noticed first the way Margaret rose slowly from chairs, using both hands and sometimes holding her breath. Then, the way she leaned on the counter when stirring, as if gravity had grown stronger for her. One day, she offered to carry the laundry basket up from the basement, and Margaret refused, too quickly. "You don't need to do that," she'd said, voice firm. "I want to," Emily replied. "I said no." The words sat between them, like something dropped and broken. Emily didn't argue, but later that night, while Margaret was in the bathroom, she wandered to the laundry room and saw the small wooden stool tucked beside the washer. On top sat a stack of folded cloths, not towels, not rags, something in between, each one meticulously pressed, as if hiding something sacred beneath the ordinary. Emily said nothing, but the next time she visited, she asked if Margaret ever thought about moving into a smaller place. Something easier, with fewer stairs. Margaret smiled too quickly. I have everything I need here. You'd tell me, right? If you needed help? Of course, Margaret said. But the lie landed heavy in her throat. That night, after Emily left, Margaret sat in her bedroom with the lights off. Her body pulsed with the dull ache that had become a second skin, but it was the fear that kept her awake, the fear of being found out, because Emily was no longer a child. And the time for hiding was running out. It was the week before Emily's bridal shower when it happened. She had come over to help clean the attic, excited to find some of the old porcelain dishes Margaret once promised to lend for the dessert table. The day was warm, spring humming outside through open windows, and the attic smelled faintly of dust and dried cedar. Margaret had protested at first. You don't need to fuss with all that old junk, sweetheart. But Emily had waved her off, laughing, already climbing the narrow stairs. She moved through boxes of Christmas decorations and baby clothes, carefully stacked books, and tins filled with yellowing recipes. Then she opened the old wooden chest tucked in the corner, one she hadn't seen before, sealed with a simple brass latch. Inside were linens, neatly folded, dozens of them, all the same size, all handmade, some stained faintly with something darker than time. Emily blinked. They weren't hand towels or rags. They were shaped too precisely. Deliberate, padded. She picked one up, turned it over in her hand. A knock on the attic door made her jump. Margaret's voice floated up, calm but edged. You doing all right up there? Emily swallowed. Yeah, just dusty. She didn't mention the cloth in her hand. She folded it back as neatly as she could and closed the lid. When she came downstairs, Margaret was in the kitchen rinsing a bowl, her face unreadable. Find anything good? She asked lightly. Not really, Emily said. She sat at the table and tried to drink the glass of iced tea her grandmother poured, but her throat was suddenly dry. She watched Margaret, the way she leaned ever so slightly on the countertop, the stiffness in her right leg, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. Something cracked, softly, inside Emily. A quiet awareness she couldn't yet name. She thought about the extra-long bathroom visits, the never-ending refusals to attend family gatherings, the vague answers, the changed gait, the towels in the laundry that didn't smell like kitchen work. She didn't say anything that day, but the next morning she went to her own doctor and, without giving names, asked about pelvic disorders in older women. The words sounded strange in her mouth, clinical and cold, but the answers were not. She came home with a weight pressing on her chest, an ache not for herself, but for the woman who had baked her birthday cakes, who had held her hand through nightmares, who had hidden this thing, whatever it was, for years. And she realized something that hollowed her. Her grandmother had been living with pain that had no witness. The following Saturday, Emily came over earlier than usual. There were no flowers this time, no cookies from the bakery near her apartment, just a quiet knock on the door and the look in her eyes that Margaret recognized from long ago. The look of someone who already knew the answer but was trying to give you a chance to say it yourself. Margaret let her in, her movements slower than usual. She had felt weaker that morning, and the familiar pressure in her lower abdomen had returned with more insistence. But she smiled anyway. She always smiled. They sat at the table, the light from the window pooling between them like a fragile thread. Grandma, Emily began, her voice soft but sure, can I ask you something personal? Margaret stirred her tea, not looking up. Of course, Emily hesitated. I found something the other day, in the attic, those cloths. They weren't just linens, were they? The teaspoon clinked once, then stopped. Margaret set it down carefully. She didn't answer. Emily pressed on gently. You don't have to tell me if it's too hard, but I'm not a child anymore, and I'm worried. There it was, that word, worried. Margaret had spent her whole life trying to keep anyone from saying it, especially Emily. Inhaled, slow and measured. There's nothing to worry about, she said. Her voice was even, too even. Are you in pain? A pause. No more than anyone my age. Are you sick? No. Then why? Margaret's voice snapped, sharper than either of them expected. Because some things are private, Emily. The silence that followed was different this time. Not the silence of routine, or of years spent in quiet understanding. This was the silence of something breaking. Emily looked down at her hands. I thought we told each other everything. Margaret swallowed. Her throat ached. You told me once that truth was better than illusion, Emily said. That you wanted ivory, not white. Margaret's lips tightened. And I told you that because I believed in your future, not in my past. Emily stood gently but firmly. If you won't let me in, I don't know how to help you. And then she left, the door closing without a slam but with finality. Margaret remained at the table long after. The tea had gone cold, her hands trembled, not from pain but from the echo of the truth she had refused to speak. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, she climbed the attic stairs alone. From a dusty box in the far corner she pulled out her wedding photo. It was black and white, framed in thin brass. She looked at the girl in the dress, at the man who once brought her wildflowers, at the way they smiled like they knew something the world didn't. She carried the photo downstairs, set it in the sink, struck a match. The flame caught slowly at first, curling the edges, then licked at the faces until they vanished in smoke and soot. Margaret watched it burn with dry eyes, not with anger, not with sorrow, but with a release that felt like exhaling after decades of holding her breath. The morning of Emily's wedding was soft and golden, as if the sky itself had decided to bless her. Sunlight streamed through the curtains of Margaret's bedroom, painting stripes across the quilt she'd made 2 decades ago. Birds sang without urgency. A breeze moved gently through the open window, rustling the sheer fabric with a hush almost sacred. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, already dressed in her best navy blue dress, the one with pearl buttons and long sleeves to cover her thinning arms. She had ironed it the night before, every pleat sharp, every hem precise. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned the small white corsage near her collarbone. The house was still. She could hear the occasional burst of laughter from outside, the florist arriving, the sound of chairs being arranged on the lawn, Emily's voice drifting up in bursts of excitement. Margaret had been invited, of course. Emily had sent a handwritten note weeks ago. You're not just attending, you're sitting front row. And I want you to say something, if you feel up to it. You're part of my beginning, Grandma. At first, Margaret thought to decline. Her body had been betraying her more frequently now. Some mornings she couldn't stand without first bracing both hands against the wall. Other nights, she woke to the sharp, humiliating sting of wet sheets and the thick weight of pain knotted in her belly. But Emily's note had stirred something stubborn inside her, a kind of old pride or maybe love's last spark before surrender. She had spent 3 days preparing, resting, eating little, moving carefully. She rehearsed standing from a chair without help, practiced walking small distances with measured, deliberate steps. She told herself, just make it to the ceremony, just get through the words, just this one day. By the time the guests began arriving, Margaret was seated in the front row, her cane tucked discreetly beneath the folding chair, her back straight despite the fire climbing up her spine. She smiled at relatives she hadn't seen in years, nodded at Emily's college friends, accepted compliments on her poise with quiet nods. No one noticed how tightly she gripped the underside of her chair with one hand. When the music began and Emily stepped into view, ivory lace flowing, face radiant and calm, Margaret felt her breath catch. Not from pride, not entirely, but from the staggering, aching thought, I may not see her wear that dress again. Her body pulsed with heat and pressure. A dull roar in her ears began to rise. But still, she sat. Still, she smiled. Because love demanded it, because Margaret Dawson had made a promise to show up. And showing up, no matter the cost, was something she had practiced for most of her life. The ceremony moved forward with grace. Emily stood beneath the arch of white roses, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto the vow card she'd written the night before. The officiant spoke with warmth, guiding them through the rituals, the promises, the blessings. Guests dabbed at their eyes, cameras clicked softly, and laughter rippled across the lawn like wind through tall grass. Margaret sat still, her palms pressed flat against her knees. Each breath was a negotiation. Her vision had begun to shimmer around the edges, a soft blur like heat rising off asphalt. She didn't trust herself to stand, not even to adjust the angle of her hips on the chair. Her stomach churned, not from nerves, but from a pressure that had grown steadily worse with each passing minute. When the officiant invited Emily's grandmother to say a few words, a murmur passed through the crowd, gentle encouragement, quiet anticipation. Emily turned to Margaret, her eyes shining, her voice light. Grandma? Margaret opened her mouth, tried to smile, then without warning her legs buckled beneath her. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no scream. Just a soft collapse like fabric folding inward. The chair tipped, and her body followed, slow and strange, as though gravity itself had taken mercy on her and decided to lower her gently to the earth. A ripple of shock moved through the guests. "Margaret, is she fainting? Someone call an ambulance." Emily dropped her bouquet, rushed forward in her gown, her veil dragging in the grass behind her. She knelt beside Margaret, whose face had gone pale, her lips parted but voiceless. There was blood, just a trace, blooming on the inside of her dress, darkening the blue fabric like ink spilled on paper. Emily's hands shook as she cupped her grandmother's cheek. "Grandma, look at me. Please." Margaret's eyes fluttered open. For a second she seemed aware. A trace of something passed through her expression, regret maybe, or release. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible. "Don't be," Emily choked. "We're going to get help. You'll be okay." But Margaret had already closed her eyes again. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Voices barked instructions. Guests stepped back. Someone guided Emily away, but she refused to let go until they lifted Margaret onto the stretcher. She saw, for the first time, the thing her grandmother had hidden so long. Not just the blood, but the years of silence, the weight of endurance, the cost of never asking for help. And in that moment, surrounded by flowers and white folding chairs and unfinished vows, Emily realized this wasn't just a collapse. It was a revelation. The siren was distant at first, then it grew into a scream, shrill, unrelenting, slicing through the soft countryside air. Margaret lay on the stretcher, the sky passing overhead in blinks of blue and white, her body strapped down, her mind fluttering between clarity and fog. The ambulance rocked gently as it sped down country roads. Inside, everything was white, too white. The lights above her head buzzed. A medic leaned over, asking questions she could barely hear. "Can you speak, ma'am? Do you know where you are?" She blinked. Her mouth opened, but only air escaped. Emily sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. Her wedding veil had been discarded, her gown rumpled and grass-stained. The bouquet was gone. Her eyes were rimmed with tears, but her grip on Margaret's fingers was fierce. "Stay with me, Grandma," she whispered. "Please." Margaret wanted to answer, to say yes, to say she was sorry, to say thank you, but her body had its own language now, and it no longer consulted her before speaking. She felt it all, the pulsing weight below her belly, the sting between her thighs, the strange sensation of something shifting inside her, loose and unanchored, shame mixed with pain in a stew so thick she could taste it on the back of her tongue. The medic adjusted the four-line, murmuring low to his partner. "Blood pressure's low. We need to prep for possible internal prolapse complications." Emily flinched at the words, though she didn't understand all of them. But she recognized the urgency, the tightness in the medic's voice. When they reached the ER, everything blurred. Fluorescent lights, fast voices, rolling wheels, paperwork, monitors, gloves snapping, curtains pulling closed. A nurse asked for next of kin. Emily gave her name, her voice shaking. Inside the small exam bay, doctors moved quickly. Vitals were checked. Blood was drawn. Questions fired like rounds from invisible guns. Has she had pelvic pain before? Has there been vaginal bleeding? When was her last checkup? Emily didn't know how to answer. She kept saying the same thing she never told us. We didn't know. I didn't know. At one point, a doctor pulled Emily aside gently and said, "We're going to run imaging." Her symptoms suggest a third-degree uterine prolapse, possibly complicated by infection. "We need to stabilize her and evaluate for emergency surgery." Emily nodded, her ears ringing. She looked through the curtain at her grandmother, small and pale, tubes trailing from her arms, the blue dress stained dark around her hips. All the strength Margaret had carried so quietly for decades had crumpled into that bed. And for the first time, Emily saw the woman behind the silence. Not invincible, not untouchable, but human. And hurting. Dr. Lisa Carmichael entered the room just after noon. Mid-30s, sharp-eyed but warm-voiced, she carried a clipboard and the kind of presence that could settle chaos with a glance. Her scrubs were plain, her shoes sensible, but there was something grounded in the way she looked at patients, especially older women. As if she understood something that couldn't be charted. She introduced herself to Emily first, shook her hand gently but firmly. "I'm Dr. Carmichael. I've reviewed the preliminary tests and imaging," she said. "We're looking at a third-degree uterine prolapse. That means the uterus has descended completely outside the vaginal canal. It's been going on for quite some time." Emily nodded, fighting the urge to cry again. She never said anything. "That's not unusual," Dr. Carmichael replied. especially for women her age from her generation. Pain like this becomes normalized, silenced. She stepped over to Margaret, who was conscious now, if barely. The older woman's eyes opened briefly when Lisa touched her wrist. "We're going to take care of you," the doctor said softly. Margaret didn't answer, but her fingers twitched once, as if acknowledging the words. Lisa ordered more labs and stepped out to follow up on intake forms. Something about the name, Margaret Dawson, pulled at her memory. She asked the nurse at the desk to access archived medical records, just in case. 20 minutes later, Lisa sat in front of an old screen, scrolling through files older than some of the interns. And there it was. April 1993, Margaret Dawson, age 35, referred for pelvic discomfort and suspected postpartum complications. One line stood out in the scanned notes, hastily scribbled in the margin by a physician long retired. Patient advised to manage symptoms, no further treatment necessary. Lisa's jaw clenched. There had been no follow-up, no imaging, no referrals, just 6 words, a dismissal disguised as guidance. She printed the page, walked back into the ER bay. Emily stood when she saw her. "I think you should know," Lisa said, holding out the paper. "Your grandmother tried. She came here 30 years ago. She was never treated." Emily took the paper in shaking hands. She read the note once, then again. "She asked for help," she whispered. Lisa nodded, and no one listened. The truth landed not like a blow, but like a mirror held up to 3 generations of silence. The years Margaret had carried pain weren't just personal, they were systemic, institutional, invisible by design. Emily looked through the curtain again, her heart splitting open. Her grandmother hadn't been hiding weakness. She'd been surviving neglect. The room was quieter now. Machines beeped in slow rhythm, like distant heartbeats. Margaret lay on the hospital bed, draped in white sheets, a faint line of sweat along her temple. Her skin looked thinner, almost translucent, like parchment left out in the sun. Emily sat beside her, the crumpled paper from 1993 still folded in her pocket, its presence heavier than any diagnosis. She had read it again and again, as if understanding the failure on paper might soften its effect in real life. It didn't. She reached out and took Margaret's hand gently, careful not to startle her. The older woman stirred, eyes fluttering open with the fragile alertness of someone who had floated too close to the edge of something dark. Emily smiled, not with joy but with love. "Hi," she said. Margaret blinked slowly, her lips moving without sound. Emily leaned closer. "I know now," she whispered. "I know what happened. You asked for help once. They didn't listen." A flicker passed through Margaret's eyes, regret maybe, or the weight of recognition. "I thought," her voice rasped, dry and faint, "if I ignored it, it would go away." Emily nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. "You were alone." Margaret didn't answer. "You didn't have to be," Emily added, her voice catching. "You still don't." Silence stretched between them. But it was no longer the kind that built walls. It was the kind that softened ground, made space for seeds. "I didn't want you to see me like this," Margaret said at last, her voice barely above breath. "I've always seen you," Emily replied, "even when you thought you were hiding." That broke something, not loudly, not in tears, but in the way Margaret's shoulders relaxed just slightly against the bed, in the way her grip on Emily's hand tightened, not out of fear, but trust. They sat like that for a while, no explanations, no apologies, just a girl holding the hand of the woman who had once carried her through nightmares, now carrying her through the unraveling of one of her own. When a nurse stepped in to check the monitors, Emily stood and kissed Margaret's forehead. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. And for the first time in decades, Margaret believed it. The sun was just beginning to rise when Emily opened her laptop. The apartment was still, the remnants of wedding decorations stacked in one corner, untouched since that chaotic day. Her dress, dry cleaned but never worn again, hung like a ghost in the closet. There had been no honeymoon, no post-ceremony brunch, just the image of her grandmother collapsing into the grass and everything that followed. But now there was something more, truth. Raw and complicated, yes, but clear in its shape. It wasn't just about Margaret. It was about all the women who had lived with pain and were told to be quiet, to wait, to manage it. Emily clicked record. She didn't rehearse. She didn't write a script. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "My name is Emily Dawson. I was supposed to get married last week. I didn't, because my grandmother collapsed in the middle of the ceremony." She paused, breathing in. "She survived." But we found out something afterward, something that's haunted me every hour since. My grandmother lived with a third-degree uterine prolapse for over 30 years, and not because she was afraid of doctors or because she didn't know better. She asked for help in 1993. A doctor looked her in the eye and told her she didn't need treatment. And that was the end of it. Emily looked down, her fingers tightening on the edge of the desk. I found the medical note, 6 words. That's all she got. She held up a copy of the printout. The camera captured it clearly, handwriting, date, and all. She went home and lived with pain every day after that. She raised 4 kids. She worked. She smiled through it. Because the system taught her that asking again was useless, Emily leaned forward. I'm telling this story not because it's rare, but because it isn't. The video lasted just under 5 minutes. She posted it under the title, "My grandmother's pain was ignored for 30 years. This is what that looks like." At first, there was nothing. A few likes, a couple of comments. But by the afternoon, the numbers began to climb. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Women began sharing the video. Some added their own stories. I was dismissed at 42. Doctors said it was menopause. Turned out to be cancer. My mom lived with bladder prolapse for 20 years. She never told us either. I'm a nurse. I've seen this too many times. Emily sat at the edge of her bed, phone buzzing beside her, and cried, not from grief but from something else, recognition. Her grandmother's pain was no longer invisible. It had a voice. And that voice was multiplying. Within 48 hours, the video reached over 1 million views. It was shared by medical advocacy groups, OB/GYN professionals, feminist authors, and a handful of celebrities who wrote simple captions, "This matters." Emily's inbox filled with messages, hundreds of them. Some were heartbreaking, others angry. Many were simply grateful. A retired nurse wrote, "I left the field because I couldn't stand watching women get dismissed every day." A woman from Michigan shared, "My mother lived with prolapse for 18 years and never told anyone. Thank you for giving this pain a name." Local news outlets reached out first, then a national health podcast, then a women's health nonprofit based in New York City. They asked Emily to speak. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't a doctor. She didn't have a background in public policy. But what she had, what no one else did, was the story, and a face behind it. A real living woman who had endured what so many only read about in medical journals. She called Margaret from the guest room of her apartment. The older woman had been recovering well post-surgery. Her voice was stronger now, steadier. The silence between them had softened into something more companionable. "They want me to speak at a forum next month," Emily said. "Women's health equity, big audience, and they want us." Margaret was quiet on the line, then a small exhale. "I'm not made for microphones," she said. "I know. But I don't think they need a speaker. I think they need a witness." Another pause. Then, gently, "You don't have to do anything you don't want to, Grandma." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Emily could almost hear her sifting through the decades in her mind. The hospital bed, the paper with 6 words, the sound of her own voice telling a doctor she wasn't crazy, only to be told it was normal, expected, tolerable. She thought of Emily's hand on hers in that sterile room, the way her granddaughter had looked at her, not with pity, but clarity. "I'll come," Margaret said, "but only if I can say it in my own words." A week later, Emily shared an update video, just a minute long, announcing that she and her grandmother would be speaking publicly. The comments poured in like waves. "Take your time, we're listening. I'm bringing my mother to hear this. She's not just your grandmother, she's all of ours." As Margaret prepared for her first time speaking in public in decades, Emily sat beside her, helping her choose a cardigan, reviewing the event schedule. "You're nervous," Emily said with a smile. Margaret chuckled softly. "I gave birth 4 times. I buried a husband. I lived with silence longer than most people live with certainty." Nervous? No, just ready. And for the first time, Margaret Dawson would no longer be a name at the bottom of a forgotten chart. She would be heard. The auditorium was modest. No marble pillars, no grand stage. Just a wide wooden floor, rows of chairs, and sunlight filtering in through high windows. The kind of space used for school concerts or town hall meetings, and yet, that morning, it held the weight of something far larger. Margaret sat backstage, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a soft gray cardigan over a floral blouse and a long navy skirt. Her hair was pinned back not with precision but with care. On her left wrist, a small pink ribbon tied loosely, a last-minute touch from Emily. The room outside was already half full. Women in their 20s, 40s, 70s, a few men too. Some wore white coats, others jeans and hoodies. But they all shared the same look, the stillness of people who had come to witness something that mattered. Emily sat beside her, scanning her notes nervously. She was scheduled to speak first, just a brief introduction, then she would step aside and leave the microphone to Margaret. "You don't have to say everything," Emily whispered. Margaret smiled faintly. "I won't. You don't have to impress anyone." "I won't do that either." They both laughed, the kind of laugh that eases 100 unshed tears. When it was time, Emily walked onto the stage, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She greeted the room, thanked the organizers, gave a brief, steady summary of what had happened, what her grandmother had endured, how it had been discovered, and why they were here. Then she paused, turned toward the side of the stage, and said simply, "And now, I'd like to introduce someone who has waited a long time to speak." Margaret stood slowly. The room quieted further. She used no cane today, though Emily had offered it. Each step she took was deliberate, the same way she had once walked to her garden gate or to the edge of a church pew, measured, dignified, unashamed. She reached the podium, adjusted the microphone. Then, without notes, she began, "My name is Margaret Dawson. I'm 67 years old. I'm a mother of 4, a grandmother of 7. And for over 30 years I lived with pain I didn't have the words or the permission to speak about." Her voice was soft but clear. Across the room, people leaned forward, not because she was dramatic, but because her truth was finally echoing out loud. "I was 22 when I got married," Margaret began, her voice steady but low. "We didn't talk about our bodies then. Not in public, not in private. You had babies, you went back to work, and if something hurt, you just told yourself it was normal." She paused. No one moved. "I had 4 children. By the last one, I knew something was wrong. I could feel my body changing in ways I didn't recognize. But I didn't have the language for it. No one had taught me the words. And when I tried to ask a doctor, he told me it was fine, that it would pass, that it was part of being a woman." She looked down for a moment, gathering breath. "So I believed him. I went home and learned how to live around the pain. I adjusted how I stood, how I sat, how I walked. I made my world smaller so that I could still function inside it." A murmur rippled through the room, people shifting slightly, swallowing tightly. "I want to tell you something I've never said out loud," she continued. "I didn't stay quiet because I was afraid. I stayed quiet because I thought I was supposed to, because I thought if I spoke up, it would make me weak, ungrateful, a burden." She met their eyes now, row by row. "But here's what I know after 30 years of silence. Pain does not make you less. Needing help does not make you weak. And asking for care should never be an act of courage. It should be the bare minimum we owe each other." Someone in the front row wiped her cheek. Margaret's voice softened. "If you are sitting here and you are hurting and someone once told you to get over it, or tough it out, or be strong, I want you to know, I see you, I believe you, and you're not alone." A long, quiet stillness settled over the room. Then from somewhere in the back, a single clap broke the silence, followed by another. And then the room was full of it. Applause rising not like celebration but like acknowledgement, like a collective exhale from people who had been holding their own pain in too long. Margaret didn't smile, not fully, but her shoulders lifted just slightly, as if the weight she'd carried for so long had finally begun to shift. She stepped down from the podium without help, Emily waiting just off stage, tears on her cheeks, pride in every breath. That afternoon, Margaret Dawson did not just tell her story. She gave others permission to tell theirs. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Margaret's bedroom, warming the floral quilt and catching the edge of the small bookshelf near her window. The room looked the same, but something inside it had changed. Or rather, someone. Margaret sat in her favorite chair by the window, her legs covered with a knitted blanket Emily had made years ago. In one hand, she held a cup of chamomile tea. In the other, a notebook, nothing fancy, just lined paper and a smooth pen. She had started writing. Not poetry, not essays, just thoughts. Half-finished sentences, questions she had never asked out loud, moments she had once buried so deep they'd gone nameless for decades. Sometimes she wrote about pain, but more often she wrote about strength. The days after her speech had been overwhelming. Letters arrived in the mail, strangers sent cards, nurses she didn't remember from earlier hospital visits reached out. And then there were the women, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, who left handwritten notes thanking her. Some mailed stories of their own, some included photographs. Most just wanted to be seen. Emily helped organize the responses. They bought a small filing cabinet together and labeled the drawers, letters, media, stories, ideas. Ideas was Margaret's favorite. That's where they put scraps of dreams, things like starting a peer support group for older women with long-term conditions, or writing a guidebook for younger women on how to speak up at doctor visits. Nothing ambitious, just things that felt possible now. Her recovery had been slow but steady. The surgery, while intense, had been successful. She no longer bled unexpectedly. The heaviness in her pelvis was gone. Some days she still felt tired, but not from pain, just age and life. Emily visited every weekend. Sometimes she brought fresh flowers. Other times she just brought silence, and they shared it without guilt. One afternoon, as Margaret watched a sparrow hopping along the windowsill, she said aloud to no one in particular, "I feel like I'm meeting myself again. The version of me that might have existed if someone had just said, 'Yes, you matter.'" She smiled faintly at the thought, and then, as if the universe had been listening, her phone chimed. A text from Emily. "Want to help me name the foundation?" Margaret's fingers hovered above the keys for a long moment. Then she typed, "Let's call it The Quiet Ended Here." And for the first time in a long time, the silence felt like something that had finally served its purpose. The nonprofit launched 3 months later. It didn't begin with press releases or gala dinners. It began with a borrowed church basement, 20 folding chairs, and a sign-in sheet printed from a home computer. Emily called it the Quiet Ended Here Foundation, just like Margaret had suggested. The mission was clear: to help older women speak about the health issues they had been taught to hide, and to make sure no one was ever told manage it again. The first gathering was quiet. 10 women showed up. Most came alone. They brought with them plastic shopping bags filled with paperwork, outdated prescriptions, journals, and, most of all, questions no one had answered in years. Margaret sat in the back at first, wrapped in a soft shawl, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't say much that day. She didn't need to. Her presence alone gave permission. After the meeting, a woman in her early 70s walked up to her, hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I watched your talk. I didn't know I was allowed to be angry until then." Margaret looked at her gently. You're also allowed to heal," the woman cried, quietly, not with shame but with relief. The meetings grew. A local librarian offered a room for free. A retired gynecologist volunteered to give monthly condas. Emily created simple printouts. What is a prolapse? How to ask for a second opinion? When to push back? They were written in large print, soft language. Every sentence was reviewed by Margaret, who would cross out anything that sounded too clinical, too cold, too professional. "We're not trying to scare them," she told Emily one night. "We're trying to welcome them back to their own bodies." At home, Margaret's days changed too. She gardened again, tomatoes and lavender. She started walking without her cane. She even joined a small online writing group, hosted by a fellow woman who had watched the viral video and wanted to write her own story. But perhaps most quietly powerful of all was this: she no longer lowered her voice when talking about her body. Not at the pharmacy, not with the new doctor, not with her grandchildren. One afternoon, Emily found Margaret sitting on the porch with 2 neighbors, both in their 60s. One of them was saying, "I thought it was just me. I didn't know that pressure down there could mean something." And Margaret replied, "Calm as ever, that's what they want you to believe. But it's never just you." Emily smiled from the doorway. The woman who had once believed her story wasn't worth telling had now made space for dozens of others to begin theirs. And somehow, without planning to, she had become the kind of elder the world needed, not loud. Not loud at all, but impossible to ignore. It was a warm September afternoon when Margaret sat down to write the letter. Not an email, not a typed document, a letter. Ink on paper, folded by hand, placed in an envelope with her careful, slightly crooked handwriting across the front. She had received dozens of letters over the past year, from women in hospitals, in small towns, in cities she had never visited. Some wrote to thank her, some asked for advice, some simply said, "I thought I was alone. I'm not anymore." But this letter was different. It was from a 26-year-old named Claire. She had seen Margaret's talk online and wrote, "I think something's wrong with me, but my doctor says I'm too young for anything serious. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'm imagining it. You seem like someone who would know what I mean." Margaret held the letter for a long time before replying. Now she placed the tip of her pen to the paper and began. "Dear Claire, you are not imagining it, and you are not too young to be believed. I was once 26 too. I didn't have the words for what I felt, and when I found the courage to ask, I was told to wait, that it was normal, that it would pass. It didn't, and neither should you. Pain is not a test you have to pass to be heard, and silence is not a virtue when it costs you your life. What I want to tell you most is this. Trust the voice inside you that says something is wrong. That voice is not weakness. It is wisdom, yours. You may have to fight to be heard, but know this, you are not fighting alone. If you ever doubt your worth, remember this. The women who came before you carried pain in silence, not because they were weak, but because the world told them they had to. You don't. We are building something better now. You are part of that. With all my heart, Margaret Dawson. She folded the letter and placed it in the envelope. Licked the seal. Stuck a small flower sticker in the corner. Lavender, her favorite. Outside, the sky was the kind of blue that made her think of childhood, of laundry lines and bare feet on grass. She slipped on her cardigan and stepped out onto the porch. Her joints ached a little. Her hair had gone entirely silver now, but her steps were steady. Across the street, a young woman pushed a stroller, waving as she passed. Margaret waved back, not just politely, but with recognition, as if to say, "I see you, I've been you, and you are not invisible." She sat in her rocking chair, a cup of tea by her side, the letter ready for the mailbox. And as the breeze moved gently through the porch railings, Margaret closed her eyes and thought, this is what it feels like to live a life no longer hidden. Sometimes the loudest kind of courage is finally speaking a truth you've carried in silence. If Margaret's story moved you or reminded you of someone you love, don't let it stop here. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more real, powerful stories that deserve a voice. And remember, taking care of yourself is never selfish. It's the first act of love.